Have you ever wondered why testing an INFJ never ends the way people expect? In this video, we're looking into why trying to provoke, challenge, or play emotional games with an INFJ is one of the biggest mistakes you can make. Let's get into it. When people say you should never test an INFJ, they're usually speaking from experience, often the kind that leaves a lasting imprint. INFJs observe more than they speak, process more than they reveal, and understand far more than they ever announce. Their nature makes them easy to underestimate, but that underestimation is exactly what turns testing an INFJ into a mistake. If you want to truly understand yourself and unlock your full potential as an INFJ, check out the INFJ Purpose Compass today. The link is in the description of this video. The first reason you should never test an INFJ is that they are naturally intuitive to a degree that feels almost supernatural. They sense emotional shifts, hidden motives, and subtle inconsistencies long before you articulate them. They don't just read what you say. They read the silence between your words, the emotional residue left after a conversation, and the energy you bring into a room. When you test them, they usually know you're doing it before you've even finished your first move. What you think is a clever trap or psychological game is something they've already analyzed, understood, and predicted. This makes testing them pointless, because the entire test collapses before it even begins. Another reason is that INFJs do not engage in competition for validation. They never feel the need to prove themselves to someone who is intentionally pushing their boundaries or provoking them. Instead of responding in the dramatic or reactive ways some might expect, an INFJ simply withdraws. Their silence is not indifference. It is a strategic decision rooted in emotional maturity. When an INFJ pulls back, they are not retreating. They are recognizing that the dynamic no longer respects their emotional safety. Testing them can quickly turn a warm, loyal presence into a distant shadow you can no longer reach. Emotional tests are especially dangerous with INFJs because they take authenticity very seriously. They invest deeply, but only when they believe the connection is genuine. If someone tries to test their loyalty, their patience, their commitment, or their emotional resilience, the INFJ doesn't rise to the challenge. They question why the challenge exists to begin with. In their world, love is not proven through manipulation, loyalty is not demonstrated through pressure, and trust is not earned by putting someone in emotional jeopardy. If you test their heart, they assume you do not deserve a place in it. INFJs also have an ability to mirror energy. When someone treats them with sincerity, softness, or respect, their response is nurturing, supportive, and deeply attentive. But when someone tests them through manipulation, silent treatment, mixed signals, or deliberate confusion, the INFJ mirrors back exactly what is being given, but with a level of precision that is almost unsettling. They amplify the truth of the dynamic and show you the emotional reality you are creating. Many people are shocked when they realize the INFJ is not reacting. They are reflecting. Testing an INFJ's intelligence is another way to lose them. They do not flaunt their insight, and they rarely announce what they know, but they are constantly connecting dots in the background. When someone attempts to trick them, lie to them, or outsmart them, the INFJ silently takes note. They won't confront you immediately. They observe, gather emotional data, and wait for the right moment to confirm their suspicions. By the time an INFJ speaks on something, they have already evaluated every angle. When someone realizes the INFJ knew the truth the entire time, the embarrassment is usually sharper than any confrontation would have been. There's also something deeply misunderstood about INFJ anger. They rarely express it outwardly, but they feel intensely. You should never test an INFJ because their anger is quiet, controlled, and absolutely final. They don't explode, they delete. They don't argue, they emotionally detach. They don't punish you, they remove themselves from the dynamic completely. When an INFJ is done, they are done without theatrics, without bitterness, and without second chances. People often mistake this calm departure for softness, but it is one of the strongest boundaries they possess. INFJs do not enjoy being pushed into emotional corners. When someone tests their patience, they handle it gracefully until they realize the test is intentional. Then they slip into a mode of protective distance that feels like ice. The warmth of an INFJ's affection is not something you can demand or tease out of them once you've crossed a boundary. They can care about you and still walk away without looking back. This duality is one of the reasons testing them becomes a painful lesson. Losing an INFJ is not loud, but it is permanent. In relationships, testing an INFJ can shatter a foundation that took them a long time to build. They do not give their vulnerability easily. They spend time observing your character, your emotional patterns, your consistency, and your values before they decide to open up. If you test them after they've already trusted you, the betrayal runs deeper than you realize. They don't just feel disappointed, they feel misled. They begin to question your intentions, your capability for emotional depth, and your understanding of connection. Once doubt enters the mind of an INFJ, the relationship begins to unravel quietly from the inside. What people often forget is that INFJs have a threshold. They tolerate a lot because they understand people deeply and try to give grace wherever they can. But once they recognize a pattern of emotional testing or manipulation, they stop giving chances. They start giving consequences. These consequences might look like reduced communication, emotional distance, a sudden shift in priorities, or a complete withdrawal. You cannot test an INFJ and expect the relationship to remain the same afterward. INFJs are protectors by nature, but not at the expense of their own inner peace. When someone tests them, it signals that the person does not value the INFJ's emotional well-being. And INFJs have learned, often through painful past experiences, that they cannot afford to remain in spaces where their heart is not safe. They will leave to preserve their peace, not out of spite, but out of emotional necessity. The truth is simple. Testing an INFJ is testing someone who already understands your intentions, sees through your masks, and knows yourself in ways you haven't admitted yet. You can win against someone's ego, someone's impulsiveness, or someone's naivete, but you cannot win against someone who operates with intuition, depth, and compassion that cuts through pretense. INFJs should never be tested because their emotional radar is far more sensitive than people realize. When someone tries to push them, provoke them, or gauge their limits, the INFJ doesn't just notice the action, they feel the intention behind it. This intention is what wounds them more deeply than the test itself. They begin to sense the shift in energy, the ulterior motives, the growing distance, or the subtle manipulation. Even if the act seems small or harmless to the other person, the INFJ experiences it as a disruption to emotional trust, and once the trust cracks, it is nearly impossible to restore. What many people don't understand is that INFJs don't operate well in emotional uncertainty. They need clarity, honesty, and genuine connection to function peacefully. When you test them, you introduce emotional chaos into a bond that they approach with sincerity and depth. The INFJ starts to read into every interaction, not because they want to overthink, but because their intuition automatically scans for meaning. A test, even a minor one, creates an atmosphere of instability that sends the INFJ into a state of internal withdrawal. They can no longer lean into the connection with the same openness because their inner compass is telling them that the relationship has become unsafe. Testing an INFJ also triggers their internal memory of past betrayals. INFJs tend to carry emotional experiences with a depth that others rarely see. They may forgive, but they rarely forget the lessons carved into them by previous disappointments, manipulative relationships, or situations where they were taken for granted. When someone tests them, all these memories rise to the surface. The INFJ begins to see parallels, patterns, and warning signs, even if the person testing them thinks the situation is harmless or playful. You're not just testing them in the moment. You're awakening every emotional red flag they've ever learned to pay attention to. Another danger in testing an INFJ is that you may unintentionally push them into their detached mode. This is one of the INFJ's most misunderstood states. When an INFJ detaches, they do so with a kind of spiritual calmness that feels unshakable. They stop explaining themselves, stop investing emotionally, and stop trying to fix or understand the dynamic. The softness in their tone becomes neutral, their attention becomes selective, and their empathy, which once made the relationship feel warm and full, begins to fade. The person who tests them often feels blindsided, wondering why the INFJ seems so distant, not realizing that the INFJ already made a silent emotional decision long before they withdrew. INFJs also dislike being pushed into emotional roles they never agreed to play. When someone tests them to see whether they will chase, prove themselves, or tolerate poor behavior, the INFJ feels insulted. They interpret this as a lack of emotional maturity and an inability to communicate directly. For an INFJ, this kind of behavior reflects insecurity, immaturity, or unresolved wounds in the other person. Traits the INFJ has no desire to nurture or enable. They want relationships built on mutual respect, not psychological games. A test signals that the person across from them is not ready for the kind of connection the INFJ offers. A deeper reason not to test an INFJ lies in their ability to see the long-term trajectory of a relationship. INFJs naturally think in arcs, not moments. They project the future of a relationship based on the emotional patterns they observe early on. If someone tests them, the INFJ immediately includes that behavior in their future projection, which often makes them conclude that the connection will become toxic or emotionally inconsistent. Testing them doesn't just affect the present. It affects how they envision the entire relationship moving forward. And once their vision of the future becomes negative, the INFJ begins to emotionally pull away to protect themselves from long-term hurt. There is also a moral component to the INFJ's aversion to being tested. INFJs value integrity so strongly that emotional manipulation goes against the very nature of how they love and connect. When someone tests them, it feels like a violation of the ethical principles that govern their relationships. They start to question the other person's character, wondering if this behavior is rooted in selfishness, insecurity, or a desire for power. For an INFJ, shared principles matter more than shared feelings. If someone's actions conflict with the INFJ's internal moral compass, the relationship loses its foundation. Testing an INFJ also interferes with one of their deepest needs: consistency. Emotional consistency is how INFJs decide who is safe and who is not. When someone tests them, the dynamic becomes unpredictable. The INFJ no longer knows where they stand or how the other person truly feels. This uncertainty drains them mentally and emotionally, often leading them to retreat to regain their balance. Once the INFJ feels like they can't rely on the emotional stability of the connection, they begin to detach as a form of self-preservation. Another reason you should never test an INFJ is that they are profoundly loyal until the moment you show them they shouldn't be. INFJ loyalty is quiet, powerful, and deeply rooted. They give the kind of presence that feels rare in a world full of surface-level interactions. But once someone tests that loyalty, the INFJ no longer sees the relationship as a safe place. Their loyalty begins to dissolve, not out of bitterness, but out of a recognition that the other person doesn't value what the INFJ was offering freely. INFJs do not thrive in environments where they feel like they must prove their worth. Their love, insight, presence, and devotion come naturally when they feel emotionally secure. Testing them replaces that security with doubt, and doubt is something an INFJ cannot ignore or suppress. It reshapes the entire emotional landscape of the relationship. Testing an INFJ is a test you will always lose, not because the INFJ wants to win, but because the act itself dismantles the very connection you're trying to measure. INFJs don't respond to tests with desperation or compliance. They respond with clarity, distance, and emotional truth. And once they see the truth of your intentions, they move in a direction that protects their spirit, even if it means walking away from someone they cared for.